Elementary music teacher friend, you love what you do, but you might feel unappreciated and, in fact, unseen some days. You may even feel like you're on a music teacher island and just want to connect with other music teachers who can relate to both your struggles and wins when it comes to teaching elementary music. I get you and understand completely the feelings you're having. That's why each and every week, the Elementary Music Teacher Podcast will provide you with solo and guest episodes that will help you realize you're not alone in your music teaching journey. Throughout each episode, my goal is for you to be able to walk away with actionable steps and ideas to help you feel like you're ready to take on the new week with whatever challenges may be thrown your way. Hi, I'm your host, Jessica Peresta, and I'm so glad you're here. Whether you're at home, in your car, in the shower, or wherever else you're listening, grab your cup of coffee or whatever other beverage is nearby and listen in to the Elementary Music Teacher Podcast.
Hi, I'm Adam Geis.
I'm David Lurch.
We're hosts of the EdTech Distilled podcast, which is a part of the Education Podcast Network.
Shows on the network are individually owned, and opinions expressed may not reflect others. Find other interesting education podcasts at edupodcastnetwork.com.
Do you want to create a curriculum you love? If we went to coffee and got to chat one-on-one, I'd tell you one of the biggest mindset hurdles I see music teachers battling is that you don't think of yourself as a curriculum designer. I completely get it because I was in your shoes. In fact, I had no curriculum when I started out, and I had to figure it all out on my own. But I did it. I developed a curriculum, and I have helped hundreds of music teachers do the same. All you need to do is follow the proven process I've laid out for you in Curriculum Design Roadmap. I'm literally giving you everything you need to show your inner critic who's boss. In this course, you'll go from feeling overwhelmed with planning lessons each week to feeling excited to show up to work each day and experience a new joy and passion for teaching elementary music because you've designed a classroom that you love. If you are wanting to successfully plan relevant lessons for any student or grade level, ready to confidently design a curriculum that works for you and your students, and overwhelmed when it comes to planning lessons and designing curriculum, then you need the Curriculum Design Roadmap. Doors close tomorrow, March 23rd at 10 p.m. Central Standard Time. Simply head to jessicapuresta.teachable.com/P/curriculum design roadmap, and I cannot wait to see you inside. Welcome back to the podcast. I'm so excited to have Aileen Miracle with me here today, and this has been long overdue. Oh my gosh, like 4 years overdue of needing to have you on the podcast. Unless you've been hiding under a rock, you should know who Aileen is. She is, I would say, one of the OGs of music education, like been in the blogging world for longer than anyone I know. And I'm just so excited to talk to you. So before we begin and get into our topic, I would love for you to just tell everybody a little bit about yourself and the work you do.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me on the podcast, Jessica. I'm very excited. My name is Aileen Miracle, and I have been teaching music, elementary music this is my 24th year. I grew up in Metro Detroit, Michigan, and I taught for 2 years in Michigan before moving to Ohio, where I did my master's degree at Capital University with a specialization in Kodály, and have taught in a few different districts and just really love what I do. So over the course of my career, I've taught kindergarten through 7th grade general music, 4th and 5th grade strings, 5th grade band, and 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade choir. But currently, and I've also done, virtual for an entire year. So currently I teach K-5 music and 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade choir. And I love it. And I have 2 daughters. My 18-year-old Jenna is a freshman at Ohio University and is majoring in English. And then my 10-year-old Macy is a 4th grader, and she's totally into Irish dancing right now, which is super fun. And Jenna plays guitar, flute, and ukulele. Maybe not flute as much anymore, but
That's so cool.
So yeah, both of them are musical. Yeah.
Yay. Okay. Well, this is totally off topic, but I get asked a lot, as a mom, are your kids musical just because you are? And that's kind of a hard conversation for me because first of all, with music education background and everything, I've always want them to experience music, but I always say I don't want them to just because I am. But it is neat when you see their musical talent and you're like trying to encourage that, where I have one doing piano and I am secretly excited because I don't want him to think like, oh, I'm just doing it for you. But I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm so excited you want to do this. So it is neat seeing like, oh my God, you're doing music. Yay.
Yeah. Well, I was Jenna's music teacher from kindergarten to fifth grade. I was her.
Oh, how fun.
School. So that was really cool just to kind of see her develop in music class. And yeah, she was in music all the way through and then started writing her own songs, which is just so fun to watch that. Macy has a beautiful voice, but she never wants me to sing. Like if we're in the car and I start singing, she's like, no, Mom, no, stop singing.
It's that age. My 10-year-old's the same. Yeah, it's like I'm at the point where Mom's embarrassing now, and it's like, okay.
Yes. Yeah. So I have to belt it out when she's not in the car with me.
I love it. Oh, I'm totally a car singer too. 100%. That's where I do my best concerts. Yes. Okay. Yeah. All right. So 2 things I love that you talk about. I mean, I love a lot of things you talk about, but 2 of the things that I've seen you present about it and talk about it on your podcast and other podcasts and workshops, centers and assessment. And so when I was thinking about this, I do want to talk about both of those areas. And I was telling you, I just think, how about we talk about using centers for assessment? Because I was kind of mentioning this to you before we push record. I think a lot of times, very well working with music teachers, sometimes they feel stuck on knowing, first of all, how to assess, or there's really not a right or wrong way, but get bogged down with how do I do it correctly? But a lot of times it's also whole class instruction. And I know that's where what was modeled for me was never, I was never taught you could do small group things or partner things and assess that way. So I want to talk about that. So let's start off. I just would love for you to just kind of explain what centers are before we start getting into the nitty gritty for a teacher maybe who's not familiar with even what that is.
Yeah, sure. So I actually first really observed centers in Jenna, who's now a college freshman. She was back when she was in kindergarten, and her classroom was, kitty corner across the hall from me. I would go in every now and then just to say hi to her, and I would see her in her kindergarten classroom doing centers. So maybe they're, learning the letter J or something. And at one center, they were on an iPad with the letter J doing something, at another center, maybe they were using Play-Doh to make the letter J. So every single center was doing something different. And that's when I was first inspired to try that in my music classroom, because I thought this could totally apply to music. I could just adapt this so this would work in a musical setting. So the idea is that what I would call like traditional centers would be 4 centers. So 4 different tasks that are around the room. And I usually do centers that are all revolving around the same concept, although you could do it different ways. You might have 2 centers about one concept and 2 centers about another. But let's say you have 4 centers that are all about the same topic or same concept. And students are split up into 4 small groups. So each small group goes to a different center. And then maybe after 5 or so minutes, the students rotate. So the students who were at center 1 now go to center 2, students at center 2 now go to center 3, and so on until they have done all of the centers. So if you're kind of trying to think about, okay, what kind of tasks would they be doing at these centers? I can give you just an example. Yeah. Let's say it's first grade. That's actually the first grade that I tried centers with. And I did it for Ta and TT, or quarter notes and eighth notes. Mm-hmm. When I do centers, I like to do 4 categories of centers. And I find that most centers that I brainstorm will fall into one of these 4 categories. There might be some outliers, but if you're kind of looking for ways to come up with centers, these categories work really well. So I use technology, manipulatives, instruments, and assessment. So let's say we're talking about Ta and TT. The technology center might be a digital game that students are playing for Ta and TT, or it might be, I have these reading games where students throw a squishy ball at my interactive whiteboard, which seems kind of crazy that we're telling students to throw something at the board. The first time I tell them to do that, they're like, what? Like, it's squishy. It's okay. You just don't need to throw really hard. So they throw a squishy ball at the board and a pattern comes up and they read it. So that could be your technology center. And maybe at the manipulative center, students are working with popsicle sticks to compose rhythm patterns or dictate rhythm patterns. Maybe at the instrument center, students have a bunch of Ta-TT rhythm cards out on stands, and they're using non-pitch percussion to play through all of the patterns. After they get done with maraca, they put it away, they get a hand drum, so on. And then maybe the assessment center is a worksheet. Those are just 4 different examples. And we'll talk about different types of assessment that, of course, doesn't all have to be paper and pencil.
Yeah.
But that's more like the traditional way of starting centers. And that's how I started. And now that my students are more comfortable with centers, I will sometimes do choice centers where instead of 4 centers, maybe I have 6 centers all around the room. And students are able to choose which center to go to, and they get to choose when to switch. So they don't have to wait 5 full minutes. Or maybe if they're at a center and they're really enjoying it, they can stay for 10 minutes. And with that kind of center setup, you could have some guidelines. Like you might say, everybody has to do the assessment center today, or you have to go to at least 3 of the 6 centers today. So you can still have some kind of guidelines, but then students have a little bit more choice. So it can work in a variety of ways. But like I said, the more traditional way would be just 4 centers and the students are just rotating every 5 or so minutes. And then you can get a little bit more experimental and try choice.
I love the choice one. Oh my gosh, that is such a good idea. I never really thought about that, like letting them choose, because students need choice. And how many times are we just saying you're going to be here and here? Well, of course you want everybody to be able to rotate, but I love that you and your students in your classroom feel so comfortable now that you give them that choice. That's so awesome. Have you noticed that works really well?
Oh, they love it. Yeah, I remember the first time I explained it to students that they were going to be able to choose. They looked at me, like several of them in every single class I did this with, were like, wait, what?
Aww.
We get to choose? And I said, yeah. And you're not going to tell us where to go? I said, no. Like,
Aww.
really? They were
Yeah.
just so excited to have that agency,
Yeah.
So
That's awesome.
yeah. And there are some centers that I think might only take 2 minutes, and some centers really could take longer than 5 minutes. So that way they can, have the choice to decide how long they're going to stay somewhere.
Okay, and that point is so true. When I was still in the classroom, I did centers, and same though. I watched a pre-K teacher do centers in her classroom, and I remember the same thing. I was like, I wanted new ideas. My school, I was just kind of restarting it and everything, and so I was trying to get a lot of buy-in from the kids, and so I just kind of used whatever I had and started doing centers with them. But what I did notice, one thing that I totally noticed was, of course, one thing would take. I remember doing a boomwhacker center, and I had one of those. I don't even know what they're called, but the thing you hang on the wall, and a lot of teachers will use them for phonics or whatever, the little pockets.
Yeah, like a pocket chart.
Yeah, thank you. I'm like, what is that called? And so I would color code the notes and have them in there. Well, that one would take a while, because by the time you assign the boomwhacker and figure out what note to play and count the rhythms, it takes a while. And then over here, like you said, if they're counting rhythms on the drums and the rhythm instruments, they would fly through that. So I would have to go, okay, now just improvise or create your own rhythms now. And well, okay, you finished in 2 seconds and you guys are needing 10 minutes. So I can see that happening where it would take, they're like, okay, I got through that pretty fast and I feel like accomplished. Yeah.
Yeah. And some students just might really enjoy a center and they just want to stay longer.
Yeah.
So
awesome.
That chance.
Yeah. Because every kiddo's different. Every kid has different strengths and weaknesses and things they like to do, for sure. Okay, so you already answered, what kind of centers do you use with your students? And one thing I want to ask is, how often do you do centers in your music room?
When I first started doing centers, it was a lot less, because I was, just kind of feeling it out and experimenting. So the first year or two that I did centers, I was maybe just doing it like a couple times a year with each grade level. And I've really pushed myself to do them more and more. The students really enjoy them. It gives them so much, especially when you set it up with choice, it gives them so much choice and agency. So I'm really trying to push myself to do them more. So I aim for at least once a quarter with every grade level. And then sometimes I do them more. Like I think with first grade, maybe I've done them like 3 times and we're not done with the second quarter yet. So I've pushed myself to do them a little bit more. So it's not like, every class or every other class. And I see my students once every 5 days or on an ABCDE rotation for 50 minutes. So I maybe see them in like a 9-week quarter. I might see them 7 or 8 times. So maybe once or twice in 7 or 8 lessons, we're doing centers.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So like
Awesome.
every few lessons.
Awesome.
Yeah, maybe every 3 or 4 lessons, something like that.
Yeah, well, that's a great way for them to practice what they're learning too with other students. And you already talked about giving them ownership. So I love that. When it comes to assessment, why is using centers an easy way to check for understanding? You mentioned there is an assessment center, but the other centers, how is this easier, or do you feel like it is easier to check for students' progress?
Yeah, I really do think it is. I think sometimes there are some assessments that are just so much easier to do in small groups. Like a good example of that is if students are dictating with, let's say, dry erase boards or popsicle sticks or something like that. When you have 25 kids in front of you and you're trying to watch how every single student is dictating a pattern, that's a little bit more challenging. But if you're working with 6 students and you can just look at, a glance or two and see how well they're doing, it just makes it so much easier for you. And something that I've done with assessment that I just think makes it so much easier is instead of writing down how every single student is doing, like I'm not writing down their name and which patterns they got correct necessarily. I might just write down their name. Well, first of all, I'll write down the names of students who are absent. And then I'll write down the students as I'm assessing them. I'll put a minus next to their name if they dictated, let's say, if we're talking about dictation, if they dictated a pattern correctly. And then at the end of the assessment, let's say I'm working with 6 kiddos and we're doing popsicle stick manipulatives and I'm just kind of seeing how they're doing. I'm clapping or playing a pattern and they're dictating it with the popsicle sticks. And if I see that Joey has 4 minuses next to his name, I can tell he's really struggling with it. But if I see that Cece has only 1 minus or her name isn't even written down or there's nothing next to her name, I know she's doing great with it. So it can just make it so much easier for you as a teacher to just have those 6 students. Another example of an assessment that I've done that would be really difficult, whole group, is I've listened to students reading rhythm patterns by themselves. So I'll just have like a reading center where I have 5 patterns that the students read to me individually. And while one student is reading those rhythm patterns individually, so let's say we're talking about ta and ti, the first pattern might be ta, ta, ti, ti, ta, and maybe they get progressively harder. And the last one is like ta, ti, 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 or something like that, right? While one student is reading those patterns to me individually, I might have the other 5 students playing on a fun app on iPads, right? Or just doing something else so that they're not just sitting there waiting. So they're still engaged as you're listening to that one student read rhythm patterns. And then that student goes and does whatever fun thing. And then the next student comes up and so on. It's just like what a classroom teacher would do when they need to listen to a student read individually. And that way you can also work with them one-on-one and say, oh, remember that one, that's called a TT or whatever, right? So if I tried to do that as a whole group, that would take so long. And then the other 23 students, while you're listening to that one student, are going to be bored and disengaged. So when you have just 6 students, it just makes it so much easier. And another example for assessment, one that I just think it works much better in centers, is I learned years ago, I learned an activity called Steady Beat Hot Seat. And I wish I could tell you who I learned it from, but I don't remember. It might have been from my friend Carla Chewinski. I don't know, but Steady Beat Hot Seat is like, you put a piece of music on with a strong steady beat, and then you have a student in a chair and they're keeping the steady beat as the music is playing. And then whenever you play the triangle, the student has to switch to a different steady beat and all the other students are matching that student or, doing what that student is doing. And it can work well as a whole group activity, but if you're using it for an assessment, if you only have 6 students, then you can just go real quick. Each student gets a 1 minute up there on the hot seat and you can see how well they're keeping a steady beat. So if I were to try to do that assessment whole group, that might take me a few lessons to get through, because if I tried to do everybody gets a turn, that would just take forever. So I just think it really, being able to individually assess or assess in small groups just makes it so much easier for you as a teacher.
Yeah, absolutely. I love how you mentioned putting the minuses, by a student's name, because you're right. You have every kid in the school. So it's impossible to assess every single student in every single class period for every single concept you're teaching. My cooperating teacher back in the dinosaur ages did that in her elementary music classroom. And that was the first time I saw that done. And she told me that when I finally got to take over her classroom, she was like, put a minus by the kids who you don't. And I was like, mind blown. Like, what do you mean? Because you're taught about assessment and it's assess every student every day. Well, but nobody talks about what to do when you have every single child.
Yeah, when you have, I have over 700 students.
And
I mean, you can look at it as I am assessing every child.
Yes.
But it's the way that I'm keeping track of the records. The way that I'm tracking the data is just a more efficient way. I still have data for every student,
absolutely,
right? But it's just a more efficient way of keeping track.
Yeah. When you are doing whole class instruction, what ways do you assess that? So if a student's facing a partner, or you probably still put them in small groups for various activities, is that when you're doing most of your assessment, when it is whole class instruction?
Yeah. So I
that question was confusing.
I just had to think through. I'll give you a few examples. I just did, I've assessed students with how well they can respond to music, which is a pretty easy assessment. I'll just put on, I don't know if you're familiar with Eric Chappelle. He has these awesome, music for creative dance, I think is the volumes. And so he has a track on each of those CDs called Potpourri, where it goes through each of the tracks on the CD, but it puts pauses in between. So it's great for freeze dance, because the students will be moving and then they'll freeze and then they'll move again and then they'll freeze. But each piece of music sounds different. So it's a great way to see, I tell the students, I want you to move the way you think the music sounds. So should we be running full speed when the music is slow and graceful? No. So can they listen to a piece of music and respond in some kind of way that looks appropriate? And of course that's subjective, but when you're watching, I just did this with kindergarten, and I'm watching my kindergartners, and all of the students are moving in some kind of way that's, super cute, matching the music. And I have one student that's just standing there. Well, that student is struggling a little bit with response to music. So it's kind of, it is a whole group activity, but I'm able to just kind of observe. Or if I'm playing instruments I did this recently with first grade, where they were just keeping the steady beat on instruments, and how well can they, play a bourdon on Orff instruments. And I might just watch 6 kids at a time do that. And the rest of the kids are singing as those 6 kids are playing. I actually have enough where probably the whole class could play at the same time. But, just space wise, sometimes I'll just take out 6 or so instruments and I'll watch those 6 instruments while everyone else is singing, and we just rotate through that. So again, that's observational. And then I have some that are, paper, pencil, the students complete some kind of worksheet and I grade that. And when I first started teaching, I think that was my view of what assessment was
Absolutely.
worksheets,
Yep.
And yeah, that can be it, but that can be one form of assessment, but there's so many other ways to assess. I've also done rhythm games. This is a pretty common way for me to assess. I have some rhythm games that I've made. I also love Linda McPherson's games. I don't know if you've ever used hers. She's got it on her TPT store. She's got all these fun games where, if you choose the right answer, then the raccoon starts dancing and the kids just go wild. It's so fun.
Oh, that is fun.
Yeah, it's really fun. So they might have 3 rhythm patterns that they're listening to a rhythm pattern, and then they're figuring out which one of the 3 matches what they just heard. And again, that's one of those types of assessments where I will, write down the students who are absent, write down the students who answered incorrectly. And then at the end of that assessment, I have a really good idea of how well students can identify rhythm patterns. You could also use clickers for something like that if you're in whole group and not in centers. I don't know if the listeners are familiar with clickers, but they're these awesome free cards that you can download from, I think, clickers.com. And the students just hold up A, B, C, or D on their card. They hold up the card in, whichever answer they think it is. And then you scan with your phone, and you have to do a little bit of legwork beforehand to enter students' magic numbers and their name for each class. But then once they hold up that card and you scan with your phone, it tells you who's correct and who's not.
Oh, that's so cool.
So amazing. And you probably could do that in centers too, but that one works well if you're not sure that students are actually voting when they're supposed to for a game like that. But yeah, so I going back to your original question, I
Mhm.
assess in a variety of ways, but like when we're in whole group, a lot of it is observational.
Mm.
But yeah, I also do paper pencil. I also do some small groups. So there's so many different ways that you can assess students, but centers for sure makes assessment easier.
Absolutely. You've already touched on a lot of this, but when teachers use assessments in their music rooms, whether it is formal or informal, are there ways this can transfer over from whole class to something like centers?
Yeah, I'll give you a few more examples here. Like if you were playing like something like Kahoot or quizzes, or I know Book It is one that a lot of people like to use, which are like quiz platforms, super fun. So
Mm.
that using, some kind of musical quiz and Kahoot or quizzes or Book It is just a great way to engage students and they love it. It can be hard to assess, really get an assessment when you're with a whole group. But if you pull it into a center, then you just have 6 students at a time. It's a little bit easier for them to play and for you to really see what they know. Something like instrumental performance, especially with something like recorder or ukulele, if you're having students perform for you, again, if you have 24 kids in a class and you're listening to one student at a time, that can be like the other students could easily get disengaged. So taking something like that and putting it, like if students are playing for belts for recorder, or if they're playing different chords on ukulele or something, it can be a great thing to put that into a center so that you can work with that child one-on-one and really help them out and give them some immediate feedback right there. And all the other students are having fun doing whatever else at their centers. So,
Mm.
and then I have taken something that I would do more whole group like worksheets, and I put them into centers because then it's just easier for students to ask questions. If they have a question about something, they can come up and ask me, and I can provide a little bit more guidance than maybe I might be able to in a whole group. And
Mhm.
something like, I already talked about this, but something like manipulatives can just be easier, especially if you don't want to make a whole class set of certain kind of manipulative because it's just so time consuming.
Yeah.
If you just make 6 manipulatives, like I have these solfa manipulatives that took me forever to make. Actually, I think this was way back in the day. I had like a student volunteer who did it for me and probably did not like me afterwards. They had to use like the Ellison machine. It was
Yeah.
like, but I have like these solfa manipulatives where I have red circles for so and yellow circles for la, and the solfa is written right on the
Mhm.
circle or whatever. And then I had to laminate them, and then you have to cut out the lamination. It's a lot of work.
Mhm.
So if you take something like that and it's going to take you a long time, just make 6 sets and then you have it in your center. So yeah, I think transferring it from whole class to centers can just be a win-win because you're working more individually. You can give that feedback and you don't need as many materials.
Yeah, absolutely. It just takes some thinking through and planning, just like you plan your lessons, just planning for centers, which is planning for lessons. One
Mhm.
thing came to mind when you were talking. You talked earlier about giving students choice, but when you are assigning them to groups, how do you go about doing that?
When I do more traditional centers, and I tell them which groups to go to, I've done it in a variety of ways, and it kind of depends on the class and depends on what I'm doing with them. I have done it randomly, like where I might say, like, if your magic number, because
Mhm.
the students in my school use magic numbers, so Joey's 1 and Cece's 2 or whatever. But I might say if your number is 1 through 6, go to this center. If your number is 7 through 12, go to this center. So you could do something like that. You could do, I have like a group randomizer that I bought from Pink Cat Studio. She has these awesome like attendance sets in her store on TPT, with all these different themes. And so I use it for a variety of purposes. But one of the things she has in there is a group randomizer. I'm sure there's probably websites out
Mhm.
there that are free too, that you could use, and you could just randomize it that way. Or I have been thoughtful and purposeful in my groups, and I've chosen certain groups. It could be homogeneous, heterogeneous, like by ability.
Mhm.
So maybe you have students who are, maybe all the same ability, and you put them all in the same group. And then you can kind of be anchored at a center and be working with, students who are all the same ability. You might have students who you have like a really high achiever in each group, and then students who are struggling a little bit in each group, and students in the middle. So it's a little bit more balanced. So it just really depends. If you're worried about behavior, I would suggest choosing the groups. I think that's, especially if you've never done centers before, I think that can be helpful. But yeah, I've done a variety of ways, and it's usually each of those ways can work, but it really just depends on the situation and your students.
Right. So what would you say to a teacher that has always kind of wanted to do centers in their music room, but maybe they're a little nervous because they're not really sure how it will turn out with their kiddos?
Yes, I would say to start simple. First of all, I would say it's okay to try something, even if it flops a little bit. I think that I'm going to get on a soapbox a little bit here, but and I'm probably going to sound like a curmudgeon, but I just feel like this, like, social media wasn't around when I first started teaching, and I didn't have, as a new teacher, I didn't have all of these amazing, beautiful, perfect looking classrooms to look at, right?
Yeah.
So I just would try something, and nobody found out about it in my Instagram stories or whatever, because there was no such thing, right?
Yes.
So I think nowadays, like, some teachers are worried about trying something because they're worried about failing, and they want that perfect looking classroom with no mistakes, but that doesn't exist. It's not out there. There's no perfect classroom. We all make mistakes. So I think just trying something. And if your administrator walks in on the first day you're trying centers and it's not going exactly the way you want to, I would just tell them, hopefully they're supportive enough to, be understanding of this. I'm trying something new. I'm working out some, kinks with this, but I'm trying something new. And I think, just having that mindset of, I'm going to try it and I'm going to see what works and what doesn't. And then next time it will be better. I think that's the first thing I would say, is that I think people just get worried about making mistakes.
Oh, you're so right. You want to do it perfectly, but there's no lesson that goes perfectly. And it's always, sometimes when I would spend the most time planning, it would not go as well. And when it was just not like I didn't plan, but it would be lessons I would come up off the top of my head, even centers. I'm going to try this. They went way better than I ever thought they would, because the kids were so excited to try something new. So, and you may not know and like you said, the word perfect, there's no perfect center, but maybe you're just struggling with, well, what ideas do I do? Just try something. Just try and see if it works, and then pivot if it doesn't work, or maybe it's not the activity that doesn't work. Maybe it's just the instructions or whatever. But you're so right. Social media can be a good thing, but it's also, it can cause paralysis analysis, because you're comparing yourself to other people and you're so worried about it. But on the flip side of that, I want to encourage the younger teachers listening. You don't have to post everything you do in your classroom and share it to social media either. You really don't. Like, just have fun in your classroom, and everybody doesn't have to know about it. So
yeah, exactly. So I would say, just having that mindset of, I'm going to try this, and there will probably be some things that won't work out, and then there will be some things that will be successful. And then I'm just going to keep, kind of tweaking it until it's, a lot better. I would start, if you haven't done centers before, I would start simple with 4 centers. I would not do choice right away. And I tell you that because I made that mistake recently. I was virtual for all of the 2020-2021 school year. I taught virtually from my house. And then I went, and I had the person who's now my traveler was there full time for me. And then I came back in person, and he became my traveler again. And so at this point, when I got my students back, it had been a couple of years since we had done centers, right? And on top of that, there were still some restrictions in place. So that kind of made it a little bit hard. But I went ahead and tried choice centers right away with them. And as soon as I let them go to choose whatever center, I was like, that was a mistake. I should not have done that. Like, I should have started with 4 centers just to get them back into the swing of things and kind of get used to what centers was like again, and then shift into choice centers. So if the choice centers is something that you'd really want to try, definitely try it, but try the 4 simple centers first. I also would not be anchored anywhere. So sometimes when I do centers, I'll be anchored at one center. Like, let's say I am observing students keep the study beat or whatever. I am observing students play the recorder. Then I'm anchored at that center. That doesn't mean I can't like assist with other centers, but it does limit my ability to help the students at the other centers. So if you have not done centers before, I would start with 4 centers. And again, I would think of those categories to kind of help brainstorm: technology, manipulatives, instruments, and assessment. Think in those 4 categories. And then don't be anchored anywhere. That way, if any student has an issue, you're not stuck somewhere trying to assess somebody. So you could use an assessment like a worksheet or something simpler that you don't have to be there to assess. And also starting with activities that students at least have a couple centers in there that the students have done that activity before, so that it's not brand new to them and you don't have to sit there and explain every little detail of that center. You can be like, oh, we're going to compose with this fake fruit today, like we did in the last music lesson. And they'll be like, oh yeah, sounds good, because they've done that before. And I can send you a link. I do have some centers that are free that you can, if I send you the link, that the listeners can download for free.
Oh, absolutely.
Try it out and see what you think.
Yeah, I'll put that in the show notes for sure. Yeah. Oh my gosh, that was such great advice. So just don't be afraid to try it. You never know. Just don't be afraid. I love all the advice you just shared. So do you have anything else to share with the listeners about maybe something we've already talked about, or maybe even something we haven't, that you want to kind of leave them with before we go?
Yeah, one thing and I've gotten this question a lot, some teachers don't have very long class periods. So if you're listening right now and you're like, I don't know that I can do this because I only have my students for 25 minutes, right? You can be creative in the way that you do centers. Maybe instead of doing 4 centers during the lesson, you do 2 centers in one lesson, and then in the next lesson, you do the next 2. And however, you keep track of who's at what center. So, if something that I said today doesn't totally fit in the box of your situation, there are no hard and fast rules. It's you adapt all of this so that it works for your students in your population and the amount of time that you have your students.
I love that. Let everybody know where they can connect with you after they listen to the episode.
Yeah, so the best place to find me is on my blog at mrsmiraclesmusicroom.com. I am on Instagram and TikTok at Mrs. Miracle's Music Room. My Facebook page is also called Mrs. Miracle's Music Room. And then my Facebook group is called The Music Room with Aileen Miracle. It's a free Facebook group. And I could send you all of those links as well.
Absolutely. I've loved this conversation. You have really sparked even ideas for me that it just makes so much sense, and everything just kind of clicks whenever you talk about assessing kids just in, smaller group setting. It just makes sense. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I've loved having you.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Well, hey there. Thank you so much for listening into the Elementary Music Teacher Podcast. There is an exclusive Facebook group just for listeners of this podcast and any elementary music teacher called the Elementary Music Teacher Community Facebook Group. Come on over and join us there, where we have conversations around the podcast episodes and encourage each other each and every week. And also head to my website, thedomesticmusician.com. I have some free resources there that you can download to help you gain traction in your classroom today, as well as the blog and the membership site and all kinds of other goodies to help you keep going in your music teaching journey. I cannot wait to keep connecting with you and encouraging you and spurring you on in your journey of teaching elementary music. Hang in there, have an amazing week, and I will see you soon.